To Immigrate with Rabia. Today we have Dan Brotman. Dan, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
So Dan is a global traveler. He is an expert in global mobility and holds multiple passports. Dan has also traveled many countries that we can count. And right now he is doing a master's program at London School of Economics and doing something very interesting in terms of research. So we'd like to get to a little bit know more about Dan, who Dan is, and what kind of research are you doing?
I am someone who has been living all over the world for most of my life. When I was 14 years old, I went to Cape Town, South Africa by myself and did a year of high school. I'm originally from the US. And after I graduated from high school, basically every decade of my life, I wound up immigrating to another country. So I've immigrated three times, and I am currently living in London in the UK, which is the fifth country that I've lived in. And immigration is a very, very important topic to me, partially because of my own lived experience having been a migrant in multiple countries, but also because we see the issue of immigration really tearing societies apart, especially in Europe and North America. This is one of the most topical issues in the world today. And I think clearly something needs to change because the way we've been managing immigration up until recently really hasn't worked.
Mhm. And Dan, you've said that you've immigrated to a lot of countries. How many passports do you hold?
So I currently hold three citizenships,
Wow.
Nice.
and I'm in the process of becoming a Canadian citizen soon. So that will be my fourth citizenship. Some people ask me if I collect passports, and the answer is no, I don't collect passports. I've simply immigrated to different parts of the world, lived in each country for a number of years, and because I become very invested in the countries that I live in, of course I want to become a citizen and fully participate in the society.
So you're both living the experience and also working in the field and now studying. Is that why you got into global mobility because of your travels that you've been doing? Or what motivated you to go into the space?
My life's mission has always been to help people become global citizens. People don't choose where they were born, but they can choose where they want to live in many cases and where they want to maximize their potential. So, as I mentioned, I've lived in multiple countries, and actually, before I lived in Canada, I lived in South Africa as an adult for about 10 years. And I started a company in South Africa that took emerging South African business leaders all over the world to expose them to how to do business globally. So I've always been about connecting people across borders, whether it's in their business lives or in their personal lives, wanting to live in a different part of the world. So any kind of work that I do is always going to be about helping people become global citizens.
Yeah. Have you faced any challenges because of living in different parts of the world?
Absolutely. I have, yeah, I would say that, navigating immigration systems is very difficult. And I'm a huge advocate of working with immigration lawyers because, you could have really good laws on the books, but that doesn't mean that the bureaucrats implementing the laws actually understand the laws. So, it's very unusual, but, I got South African citizenship. I naturalized there, which is very, very difficult.
Hmm.
My application was unlawfully rejected, and I didn't accept that because I knew that I complied with the law. And my case actually went all the way to Parliament and was on national news, and I was granted citizenship in the end. But I wouldn't have been able to advocate for myself had I not worked with really good immigration lawyers. So I would say that that is definitely the challenge of being an immigrant is navigating bureaucracies where sometimes even the bureaucrats don't understand the rules that they need to follow.
Yeah.
And you've been very persistent throughout. But you've also outside of lived in a bunch of countries. You've traveled to a lot of countries. Do you have a current count of how many countries you've been to?
So a big debate among travelers is what counts as a country. I go by the definition of UN recognized countries.
Fair enough.
Okay.
So I'm currently at 91 UN recognized countries, but I have a bunch of trips planned this year, especially being based in the UK. It's very easy to travel to other parts of the continent. So my goal is to reach 100 UN recognized countries by the end of this year. And I've been to very, very unusual countries that don't see a lot of travelers. I've been to places such as North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Sudan. Rabia, I've been to Pakistan, which I know
Wow.
is where you're originally from. And, part of my life's mission, besides helping people become global citizens, is also humanizing people in parts of the world that are often stigmatized. So when I travel to these countries, I really try to connect with ordinary people and hear the stories that we don't see on the news and come back to my home country and share with people what they're not seeing in the mainstream media. Most recently, I returned from war-torn Ukraine. That was this past December. And there's a lot that I saw and learned there that we don't see in the mainstream media. And I've been giving talks here in London just about what my experiences there were like.
Wow.
Yeah. Which part of Pakistan did you go to? Was it Lahore or was it Islamabad?
So we were in Islamabad and
Yeah.
also in Peshawar. We were traveling to
Nice.
Afghanistan, and this was after the Taliban took over. So the only reasonable way to get a visa for Afghanistan, because the Afghan officials at the various embassies around the world were actually from the old regime,
Mm.
and we
Right.
needed to get visas from the new regime. So Pakistan was one of the very few places where you could get those visas. So we spent a few days in Pakistan. We went to Peshawar, we got our visas, and then just a couple of hours later, we were on a plane to Kabul.
Wow.
Amazing.
Wow. And so, what took you from working in the space and traveling the world to studying at the London School of Economics?
Well, I mean, even though I was involved, I would say informally in immigration related issues beforehand, it was actually my move to Canada that really made me realize that I wanted to help people become global citizens in a different way, which is in terms of where they choose to live.
Hmm.
So when I came to Canada, I took over a community organization that wanted to grow. It was the Jewish community of Windsor, Ontario, and it was a shrinking community. And they really wanted to grow because if they didn't grow and replenish, there wasn't going to be a Jewish community in the future.
Oh, so you mean you were like a leader of the organization? You were,
So I was the executive director of the umbrella body of the organization, the Windsor Jewish Federation, and I
right.
had this crazy idea when I was thinking about what this role could look like if I were to be the head of it, and that was that Canada at the time had a plan to bring in 1.5 million immigrants over the span of just a few years. So there was going to be a flood of immigrants coming into Canada. Some of them were going to be Jewish, just because you were going to have people from all different backgrounds. And naturally, people tend to move to large cities like Toronto, Vancouver, because that's what they know.
Right.
And I said to the community, we had this incredible opportunity to actually proactively market our city and the Jewish community to some of these people immigrating and get them to move to Windsor instead of the GTA, for example.
And
So we
where is
started.
Windsor geographically relative to, Toronto or some major US centers, just for people who don't know?
So Windsor is in southwestern Ontario. It's a city of about 200,000. It's
Okay.
on the border with Detroit, Michigan in the US. So in many ways, it's just an American city that happens to be on the Canadian side of the border. My house, for example, in downtown Windsor to downtown Detroit was door to door a 5-minute drive.
Wow. Okay.
When you turn on the
That's
radio, it's
close.
American
Yeah.
radio stations. I would say it's about a 3.5 to 4 hour drive to Toronto. So you're essentially closer to many more American cities than Canadian cities. But because of manufacturing leaving the Rust Belt, leaving regions like Windsor and Detroit and Ohio, many young people left Windsor. At one point, it had the highest unemployment in Canada. And so the Jewish community needed to replenish. So we started this program We connected prospective immigrants with immigration attorneys such as yourself. We gave relocation stipends to help people offset some of the costs because it's very expensive to immigrate. We helped them with employment using our own networks, and we wound up bringing people from all over the world. And I really, really enjoyed this work. At the same time, people were telling their friends in their home countries who were not Jewish about the work that we were doing, and people said, I need help, like not just legal help in terms of, getting a visa for Canada, but like I don't even know if Canada's the right destination. There's so many emotional, factors that you need to think about when you're going to immigrate. And so I said, you know what? Why don't I set up a side business? Not for Jewish people, but just who want to move to Windsor, but just for anyone who's thinking of immigrating countries because I've done it so many times and help them. So I started a business called Migration with Dan, which I still run, and I do immigration coaching. So I help people really think through their decision to immigrate because it's not right
Mm.
for everyone. And I just became so immersed in this field that I said, you know what? Like, I never actually formally studied it. I've just lived it. And I want to formally study it. This is really becoming one of the most important issues in the world today. And we need fresh thinking around how we manage immigration globally. And I want to be someone who comes and helps find solutions. So I applied to the London School of Economics. I'm doing a master's in international migration and public policy. So it's very much focused on immigration policy, but not only within Europe, rather globally. And it's a 1 year master's program, and that's what I'm currently in the middle of.
You also have a global mobility specialization.
Yep, I do. So I that was sort of my taste of studying immigration. Was I actually with the industry body for global mobility specialist got certified as a global mobility and talent specialist. Global mobility, for those who don't know, is when companies move employees to different offices around the world. So, like, let's say someone gets a transfer from London in the UK to Toronto. There would often be a global mobility specialist who's helping them think through immigration implications, tax implications, and a whole host of other issues. It's a very big decision to move countries, but that's doing it under the auspices of your employer. And yeah, so I think that was the first natural step towards studying immigration. And then the second step was deciding to do it for a full year, and that's where I am right now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can also relate to it a little bit because I'm an immigrant myself. And I feel like the part where you're planning to move is one of the most important parts rather than just moving. So helping someone out and making those decisions and kind of thinking through the process, I would find that really helpful for someone who's sort of deciding like what is my next step and like how am I gonna like make that plan to move.
Yeah, yeah, and immigration, as I said, is just not right for everyone. I mean, I think that there's a huge expectation mismatch when people immigrate. So people often, they often want to work at the same level that they worked back home. They want the same standard of living that they had back home. They don't always anticipate how changing cultures could impact their kids, could impact their relationship with their spouse. So I think it's really thinking through everything. And immigration is, again, it's not right for everyone. If you're nervous about the situation in your home country, there are ways that you can send funds offshore so that you feel more economically secure, but maybe staying in your home country makes more sense for your personal situation. So it's, I think immigration lawyers are so important, but as you know, their job is not to talk to people about the, issues with their spouse and their career aspirations. And people need someone to talk to, and they need someone who's been through it. And I feel that that's the value that I've added both professionally as well as just a friend to many people who have moved countries.
So you've gone through the personal journey of immigration. You visited a lot of countries, met a lot of people. You've helped companies and it sounds like professionals move around the globe. Can you tell us a little bit about what your current studies are, your research at London School of Economics?
Sure. So the system here is really interesting because, as you know, in North America, master's degrees are typically 2 years, and in the UK, it's only 1 year. So basically, we have two terms of coursework, which is what I'm doing right now, and then we have a dissertation. So I just completed a paper for one of my classes that was called Migration from Below, and that's looking at immigration not from the government's perspective, but from the migrants' perspective. And I specifically looked at international students in Canada. Now, as I mentioned, I lived in downtown Windsor. I lived in a neighborhood where there were many international students, and to be honest, international students in Canada was that was never something that I even thought about. They were just
Mm,
there. But I think that coming to the UK now and being an international student myself, it opened my eyes to how complicated it can be when you go study in a different country, because often students don't go study in another country necessarily just for the studies. They see it as a pathway to immigrate. And as you're very aware, Canada imposed a number of restrictions on international students early in 2024.
right.
And I really wanted to look at how those restrictions are impacting international students currently in Canada, and also how is it going to change how prospective international students view Canada as a study destination. So that was the latest paper that I just wrote, which was fascinating. I learned so much. And I also compared and contrasted it to my own experience in the UK, which has some restrictions that are similar to Canada and others that differ. And then for my dissertation, which I'm going to be writing this spring and summer, actually going to be focusing on the United Arab Emirates. I'm really, really interested in the Gulf region. Countries like the UAE have the UAE specifically has the highest proportion of migrants in the world. 90% of their population are
Wow.
migrants. Um, but what's interesting about the UAE
Sorry,
is they
Dan, how does that compare to like Canada, the percentage?
my understanding with Canada is I think it's about 25% in Canada,
Okay.
which is, I mean, again, it's still very, very high. I believe the UK is only like 14%. So Canada, for a Western country, Canada is considered high at about 25%, but this is like 90%. What's
Wow.
different, though, is that Canada offers pathways to permanent residency and citizenship. So when you move to Canada, there is the possibility, if you plan things correctly, that you might be able to plan for a long-term life in the country. And with the UAE, they historically operated off of the kafala system, which basically tied you to an employer. So you could only move to the UAE for a specific job with a specific employer, and if you were to lose that job, you're out. There's no option of retiring in the country after you finish working.
Mm,
When your kids finish high school, they can't stay there. They're not permanent residents. They have to leave. So you're kind of just like, even if you're highly skilled, you're just a guest worker. What
right.
changed in the UAE, I would say a little bit before COVID, but especially after COVID, is the UAE has liberalized their immigration system, and they're making it actually much more similar to countries like Canada. So now there's a pathway to self-sponsor, like similar to how in Canada there's the express entry system, where if your score is high enough, you can get permanent residency in Canada without a job offer. The UAE is now introducing a way to move without a job offer. You can self-sponsor. They're allowing people to sponsor their adult children, to stay into retirement, and even to become citizens, which was unheard of.
Mm,
So I want to look at why in Western countries are we seeing immigration restricted, but in countries like the United Arab Emirates, they're actually liberalizing immigration, and
mm,
they're making it easier for people to build long-term lives there. So that's going to be the focus of my dissertation. I'm going to be spending a bit of time in the UAE this summer, conducting research.
right.
But yeah, I'm just loving studying this.
And you're an international student yourself right now.
I am.
You did a research paper on international students for Canada. You mentioned that a lot of international students come and they're there to study, but they also want to stay. How common is it that somebody who is, for example, coming to Canada as a student wants to stay? Is there research on that? What did you find?
Sure, there absolutely is research on this. So I mean, I would start out by saying that Canada specifically, unlike the UK and unlike the US, was really marketed, I would even say by the Canadian government as a an educational migration destination. So there was a whole marketing campaign by the Canadian government called Study, Work, Stay, where they talked about how if you came to Canada to
Yeah.
study, you would be able to actually work in the country, and they even talk about eventually becoming a Canadian citizen.
Wow.
Yeah.
I compare that, for example, to my experience in the UK. The British government would never do that. No one comes here um, you know, promised by the government that they're going to be able to permanently settle in the UK. And I would say the same about the US. Typically, when you come to the US or the UK to study, you come purely for the education. Now, of course, there is OPT in the US, so there is a way in the US where you can stay, for at least a year after your degree just to get some local work experience. In the UK, we get a graduate visa, so we can stay for 2 years.
Yeah.
But that's it. Like if you both in the US and the UK, if you want to stay permanently in the country, that's generally going to involve employer sponsorship. That has nothing to do really with your studies. Whereas in Canada, it was very much marketed as you come and study here, and this is a pathway. This is a pathway to permanently migrate. It got to the point where Canada per capita had 9 times as many international students as the United States.
Nine
So
times. So
nine
that's
times.
in raw numbers, that would almost be equivalent numbers of because the US is about 9 times larger than Canada in terms of population.
It was a very, very large number that came to Canada. And a very interesting study was conducted by the Canadian Bureau for International Education. They surveyed over 32,000 international students in Canada. And it was something like I think it was only 16% of them intended on returning home after they finished their studies, immediately after they finished their
Yeah.
studies. And about 43% of them actually intended on applying for permanent residency eventually. So it's very, very clear that, coming to study in Canada for, I would say the majority, if not at least half, it was really a pathway to migrate, but it was encouraged by the government.
So
And I think that suddenly the goalposts were changed. And that's kind of what I looked at in the paper that I wrote is that this is a huge investment for people. That you have people that are taking up massive student loans. Their families are, selling whatever they can so that they can send one child to study in Canada with the hope that, again, if they do everything that the Canadian government's promising, they'll eventually become Canadian citizens. They'll be able to send remittances. Maybe they'll be able to sponsor family members in the future. It's a huge investment of more than just one person. It's an entire family. And you suddenly see people in Canada who have been studying there for several years, and they're not really going to get a return on that investment because suddenly they're going to graduate and their opportunities to settle permanently in the country are no longer going to be available. So it's a bit of like a bait and switch in the middle of their degree. And this is causing enormous emotional distress for international students. There have been reported suicides.
wow.
And
Wow.
that was part of what I covered in my paper. And I also specifically looked at, sort of what are these various restrictions that international students are now facing. I think some of them are just not setting students up for success. So
Hmm.
I was quite critical. And as I said, I compared and contrasted some of the new restrictions in Canada to the restrictions on international students here in the UK.
So you said there was 1.5 million. I think that's what you said Canada had targeted when you were with the organization in Windsor. Is over a span of, was that 3 years for permanent residency? And a lot of international students were coming. So this is all fairly recent. What is now happening that would take that study, work, stay, dream away from international students? What's the big picture context that those international students who did decide to come a few years ago are now facing today?
Sure. So I just wanted to actually just correct one thing. So the number of international students in Canada and the US, it was actually, as you said, pretty much the same, but the population of the US is 9 times greater than Canada. So it's not 9 times more international students, but that's still a
No, no,
huge,
that's proportionally. Yeah,
right,
got
proportionally.
it.
Um, yeah, I mean, One thing that I looked at was again it's now created a debt trap for students. So students have taken out huge loans to be able to study in Canada, and there was as you mentioned, Canada was bringing in like 1.5 million permanent residents, but up until recently there wasn't a cap on temporary residents. So you had this massive influx of students coming into the country,
Right.
and many of them are in debt,
And so the
and
students are coming as temporary residents, not as permanent residents.
they're coming as temporary residents, but they're really hoping to eventually be selected as permanent residents. And I mean, as you can speak to much better than me, it has become so competitive now
Mm.
to be
Right.
selected for permanent residency in the express entry system. So even if, like, first of all, many students now are not going to be eligible for postgraduate work permits. So if you study at a college, in a field that is not deemed, to be, I guess, where there's not a scarcity.
Right.
So then you're actually not going to be eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So students are going to be going into a lot of debt. They may have to return to their home countries and not even be able to work in Canada to be able to repay that debt, and they're not going to be able to repay it, in rupees. But more importantly, going back to what we were talking about competitiveness, even if you are granted a postgraduate work permit, it's just become so competitive now that even with that Canadian work experience, many of these people will just never qualify for permanent residency. And
Yeah.
that was something that the Canadian government never told them. If you really look at their marketing materials, it was pretty straightforward. Like, you stay, you work, and you study, you work, and you stay.
Right.
And all of a sudden, they can study and pay four times more than Canadians. Um, some can work, some can't work after their studies, depending on what they studied and where they studied. So that's not so true anymore. And then in terms of staying, I think that again, that's becoming really difficult. So this is a massive investment and a debt trap for many people who look at what the Canadian government is marketing to them. They say, I'm going to go into so much debt to make this investment into my future. And then all of a sudden, they're going to discover that they're never going to be competitive for permanent residency. And they're going to have to move back to their home countries really indebted. And they're never going to be able to repay that debt because, again, the currencies and the salaries in their home countries are much lower. It's just extremely unfair. And again, as an international student in the UK, that promise was never made to us as international students. We came here purely for the education. We knew that we were going to get a postgraduate work permit, but there was no promise about a permanent path to settlement afterwards.
Yeah, and we also see that firsthand. Like a lot of the international students that we're speaking to now, sometimes like they will enroll in a program and they know that there's no pathway, so they're going to enroll in another program and they continue to study for years.
Right. Yeah.
Which is like they've been a student for so many years, but then at what point do you sort of decide that can they stay here permanently or not?
And you're pointing to the cost of this. So you have
Yeah,
international students who came when the marketing, which you
exactly.
said hasn't really changed, still study, work, stay.
That's so interesting because I mean, I don't know if you ever noticed it, but I don't think I noticed it. Does it stay like does it say that online?
Yeah, it's on
Yeah, it does.
the
It
immigrant
hasn't been,
Yeah,
it
it's
hasn't been
website.
taken down as of
very
a few weeks ago.
What's interesting is that you come to Canada and you follow this study, work, stay pathway. And then you study, and then after you're here, the rules change, and you find out what you studied may not qualify you for
yeah.
a work permit. You said now it's connected to fields where there's critical labor shortages. Or even if they grandfather you in, you now have to take one of the new requirements is you have to pass a language test. So you needed a language test to get into school to prove that you were competent to study your diploma program, your degree program, and then you take a language test again. And then, for those who are a little bit farther along, who are on post-graduation work permits, you've highlighted the competition, the difficulty now with getting permanent residency through express entry. One of the things that did change towards the end of last year was the adjustment of the Canadian immigration levels targets. So it went from welcoming 1.5 million people over 3 years this upcoming year's permanent residency target is down to under 400,000. I think 395 is now the target. So from 500,000 a year to that's a significant drop, a 20% reduction in permanent residency spots at a time where it sounds like you're saying there's a lot more international students who are coming to Canada than before. Do you have you come across any numbers about like maybe what was happening a decade ago versus today, or is that something that the focus of your paper is more on the international students' individual experience?
So I was more focused, it was a migration from below class. So focused much more on the experience of the migrants. However, you mentioned about the immigration targets in Canada being revised and it becoming, many fewer permanent residents are now going to be admitted to Canada, but they're also reducing the number of study permits that they're issuing. So,
Mm,
it's also interesting because the cost of living requirement is now double. Which again, many say is a good thing. Canada has become very expensive and it really reflects the cost of living. But either way, there are multiple barriers to entry now that just didn't exist before. So doubling the cost of living requirement to get a study permit. As I mentioned, in many institutions, it's four times the tuition for an international student. And even if you want to get a post-graduation work permit, for example, you now have to take a language test, which is an additional cost. So there are many more expenses now. There are fewer study permits being issued. I believe initially they were going to reduce the number of study permits by 35%.
mm,
So
mm,
it's everything's more competitive. It's more competitive to get a study permit in Canada now. It's much more competitive to be selected for permanent residency. It's just much, much harder. But if you look at the marketing material, it doesn't really look like it's that hard. And this is really affecting students now who thought that there was this straightforward pathway, and they're just these insurmountable obstacles now, and they're highly, highly indebted. They're estimating that enrollment for international students at Canadian universities and colleges would decline by at least 45% for the 2024-2025 academic year.
That's a
wow.
And
high
you know,
number. Yeah.
it's a very high
It's a high
number. And I think
number.
something that
Yeah.
we also need to just consider is that,
Hmm.
with public funding often getting cut to universities and colleges, these institutions are very reliant on tuition from international students who pay so much more. So something that I also wonder is, I've read news articles about colleges in Canada that are either going to just completely shut down or they're having to lay off a lot of staff. There are university towns in Canada that are really reliant on the student population and the university for their economy. What's going to happen if these institutions are now really struggling? So, what I would have liked to see happen in Canada is if they were going to make these restrictions, I would have liked to see the government at the same time increase funding to universities and colleges because the institutions themselves are really going to suffer.
Mm,
And I think that, I think what Canada needs to do is not just say, okay, we're going to just, cut the number of study permits that we're issuing and we're going to just increase the requirements to get a postgraduate work permit. What I'd really like to see is a total change in approach of what it means to study in Canada at a Canadian university. So as I said, in places like the US and the UK, these universities are marketed for their education. That is really why you study there. Canada needs to completely change its paradigm, in my opinion, and it needs to market its institutions of higher learning as just what they are, institutions of higher learning. You come to Canada purely for the education and take the migration out of it.
mm,
The alternative would be you need to have a very, very clear pathway in this new era that we're living in for international students to be able to stay in the country. And you need to be really, really clear about what that looks like. And you can't create a situation where people are investing potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then they find out halfway through their degree that there's no chance they're ever going to be able to stay in the country. So I've heard some people say um, that, maybe Canada should be much more selective about which international students it admits, maybe students only in fields where there's a scarcity, but then we guarantee permanent residency to graduates who study in those fields.
right,
Uh,
right.
I know that President Trump in the US has spoken in the past about giving a green card to every international student who graduates from an American university. I don't see that happening in Canada, but Canada could say if you're a graduate at an accredited institution in these fields, we will guarantee permanent residency. But I think just, creating all of these obstacles and continuing to market Canadian higher education as a pathway to permanently settle in the country, I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's going to render Canada ultimately very, very uncompetitive in the international student market.
Yeah. I think it all comes down to being transparent and honest
I agree.
expectations.
So we had marketing that said study works day, accompanied by what sounded like artificially low numbers that the Canadian government was presenting for cost of living, which they've doubled, but sounds like it's still low. And then the students have to be able to demonstrate in their application that they can meet those costs plus the cost of their tuition, which is 4 times higher. And we have lots of international students now, millions of international students for a handful of permanent residency spots. Which I should add, those aren't spots just for students that are just under 400,000. It includes everyone, skilled workers, family sponsorships, humanitarian, refugee. And so you have this almost an underclass in Canada of temporary students and workers now who've obtained their post-graduation permits, who are looking at a fraction of the spots that were previously available. And you're saying that that's because Canada's immigration policy concerning international students wasn't focused on marketing the institutions as being institutions of higher learning. It was marketed as a pathway for migration, for permanent migration. And that attracted a lot of people. So now that the numbers have changed, I'm just like, when I think of international students coming to Canada, right? I also studied abroad for a year in France to do a master's of international law, right? And I did that for the experience of learning French and learning international law. It was beneficial for me from a really good university, Jean Moulin in Lyon, France. And that was my perspective as a student. As now an immigration lawyer in Canada, as a Canadian, I'm just wondering, like, what was the point of bringing all these international students to Canada, marketing them as a pathway for permanent residency, but then once they're here saying, well, there's really not a pathway. Was Canada doing this to train the next generation of the best and brightest? As you said, it wasn't to market our institutions for being competitive internationally as institutions of higher learning. So what's your sense of this? Did you come across anything in your research? Like, why did the government do this, or did they even have a reason?
I mean, it depends how cynical you want to be. I mean,
Oh, no.
something I find very curious was, during COVID and a little bit after COVID, international students were able to work up to 40 hours a week, which is just like unheard of.
They could work
Um,
full time in Canada, you're saying, when they
They
were.
could work, they could work full time, and there were again, not the majority. There were students who were abusing the system. I believe it was 19% of international students who held study permits. They weren't even like registered at the universities where they received study permits for. So a lot of people.
1 in 5 international students weren't going to school, so but they could work. You're saying or at
No,
least
but
in
they could
theory.
work because they held study permits. So I think that a system was created where it was almost like the studies became secondary and migration became the primary motivation to go study in Canada. So again, when someone's trying to build a long-term future in a country and you're telling them that they can work 40 hours a week, they can work full time, their focus is really going to be on, and the country is becoming a lot more expensive. Their focus is probably going to be more on working and building a life in the country, and maybe not as much on the studies. So I think that might have been a mistake. I know that at the time there was a labor shortage in Canada, and I think international students were kind of seen as like a sort of a cheap and easy solution to bring in temporary workers, to work in the service industry, for example.
Hmm.
So it was a way that the institutions of higher learning, they could get a lot of tuition money. So it was good for them. It was a solution for industry in Canada that needed low-cost workers. So I think that there were special interests that were actually benefiting from that, but who wasn't benefiting from that were the students. And again, it just reoriented the focus away from studies and towards work and permanent migration. The problem is that when they changed that, again, you had students in the country who really they couldn't afford to study in Canada. The only way they could study in Canada is if they were working full time. So suddenly you're telling them, actually, we're only going to let we're only going to let you work half time now. And that wasn't sustainable. So what that ultimately did is it pushed a lot of people to work under the table, which set them up to be exploited. It put their own status as international students at risk. So yeah, I think I think that people were let into the country to study who could have never studied in the country sustainably. The goalposts were switched halfway, and suddenly they couldn't work full time anymore, couldn't sustain themselves. It was messy. It was messy, and I think there needs to really be a much bigger rethink. It's easy for a politician to say, we're cutting the number of study permits that we're issuing. It sounds good, but I think we really need to think more carefully about what competitive advantage does Canada offer for universities and colleges that, let's say, the neighboring United States doesn't. It's not going to be migration anymore because, as you said, it is so difficult now for international students to get permanent residency. So I think we need to change our focus.
And just as you're talking, I'm thinking actually about your focus of your thesis for the UAE. It's brought in so many temporary workers, and so maybe there's something that Canada can learn from the UAE's experience, where such a high percentage of that population was temporary residents. Canada is now has a very high percentage of international students who have come over and temporary workers that have come to the country relative to our population of 40 million. It's 5 million temporary residents in the country. And I think that's even underestimating when we're not counting undocumented people who've come and stayed beyond their status. And so we're, compared to the United Kingdom, as you mentioned, a population with huge numbers compared to the United States, huge numbers. So maybe there are lessons that we can learn by just looking at the UAE. Is there any focus part of your study there or your research so far into the UAE system that would suggest better pathways that they're exploring that Canada should maybe learn from?
Well, I would say it goes back to what Rabia was saying, which is it's all about transparency. So in the UAE, when people come as temporary guest workers, there's no pretense that they're going to be able to transition to permanent residency. You
Interesting.
you come for a job, and that is it. And when your employment ends, you leave the country. There's a different category of migrant now that has been created, as I mentioned. They've introduced a golden visa and a green visa. People can self-sponsor. That's completely different. So I think that maybe part of what's happened in Canada is, Canada's constantly talking about people transitioning. Come
Mm.
as a temporary worker, transition to a permanent resident. And I think that's kind of what's not working right now. So if the Canada were to learn from the UAE, it would be to completely separate them, to stop promoting transitioning, to say you can cut your it's sort of like when you come to the US on an H-1B, it's a temporary status. You're going to work for an employer. It's temporary. There's absolutely no guarantee that you're eventually going to be able to find a way to become a permanent resident. So I think what Canada can learn from the UAE is to completely separate temporary residency from permanent residency, to stop promoting people from from studying, working, staying, and to say you're here for a purpose, and when your job ends, if you can't find another one, thank you for coming, but you're gone. And I know that that's harsh, but that's how many other countries operate. And maybe that's how Canada needs to operate going forward.
I also think that just thinking this out loud, like there could also be a system, for example, for students, like if you score a certain number of grades or if you are meeting certain number of threshold, you may be eligible for certain types of work permits. So that is also going to motivate them to actually focus on their school, which is why they're here, which also benefits the economy because they're actually learning as opposed to doing other things. So, like, just thinking this out loud right now, like that could also be one of the things that can be added in some way
Mm.
into the system. And also, I think that rethinking about the temporary students that are already here. So if
Right.
we're going to be proposing something that could be for students that are coming in tomorrow, but then the students that are already here, I think we can rethink how we're going to manage them or how can we make best use of these students because at the end of the day, they did go to Canadian schools and they've learned some sort of skills that we
Right.
could,
And there was a policy a few years ago,
yeah.
where this was during the COVID era where the borders were largely shut. Canada created a pathway, temporary resident to permanent resident pathway
Oh yeah.
for international students, and I
It
think
filled out so quickly, I remember.
yeah, I think it was
Yeah,
40,000 spots, and within 25 hours
it was
it
gone.
was gone. So
Yeah, I
there's
remember that one.
so it goes back
But
to yeah. Go ahead, Dan.
no, I was just gonna say, but again, the UK doesn't have anything like that. Like the UK, it's like you get your postgraduate work permit, and then it's, you're on your own just like anyone else. And so that's what I think Canada really needs to think about is like, do they want to have these transition pathways, or do they want to operate more like the UK, more like the UAE, where it's like it's great that you study here, will allow you to get a little bit of work experience afterwards, but then if you're going to compete for permanent residency, you need to compete just like anyone else who didn't study in Canada. Something that's also interesting in the UK is they have something called like a high potential individual visa. So these are people who studied at, I think it's like they have the list of, I think it's the top 20 universities in the world. And if you graduated from one of the top 20 universities in the world, I think it might be over the past 5 years, then you get an open work permit for the UK. And so something that Canada could also think about if they just want to attract great minds, they could, for example, just say, we're going to like invite anyone who within the last 5 years studied at one of the best universities in the world. We're going to give them an open work permit. We're not going to promise them permanent residency, but we see that they're high potential, so we're going to invite them into the country. But you have so many and Minister Mark Miller spoke about this. He called them like puppy mills. Like you have so many sort of bogus colleges in Canada that where sometimes I think it was upwards of like 80-90% of their students, if not 100%, were just registered there so that they could stay and work in the country. They weren't even going to class. They weren't really giving them skills that would make them economically independent afterwards.
So
So
Canadians weren't even studying really there. This was all international students who were getting a wow. So what do
yeah,
we
so not all institutions are also created equally. So I mean, this is a
right?
big question that I also think about is like, do you treat someone who studied at McGill the same as someone who studied at a fly-by-night college? And I know that they're starting to try to rectify that with the policy around the postgraduate work permit for university grads versus college grads. But and it might sound really, really harsh, but I think that out of this conversation, I'm really thinking about just eliminating the transition and just having a hard separation between temporary residents and permanent residents with two completely separate processes that don't speak to each other.
And for those that are here, I suppose if they can't compete for a competitive pathway for permanent residency because the numbers don't match, there will be a vast majority of them who won't come in that way. We need like a humanitarian option for them. We need something. I mean, they spent so much money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, years of their lives, and they're
Yeah.
in the workforce. That I could imagine how devastating it's going to be for Canadian employers who relied on them. Personally, how devastating it'll be. Um, and that's something that Rabia and I are now talking to a lot of international students, former international students, about is humanitarian and compassionate grounds, applications for permanent residency. It's not a surefire pathway like the express entry system, maybe if you can somehow compete against you're this cohort of super qualified, highly educated, integrated workers for permanent residency. But it maybe gives them something to hope for, or maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe we're if Canada or others are looking for this pathway, then we also just need to be honest with international students too that who are here. Like
Yeah.
you're adults, our government did what it did. We can try this, but it might be your last option. But understand the risk. You may be going home, and it'll be unfortunately, I think a scar that's going to stay on the country for a long time, suffering a reputation as a welcoming place for new immigrants. Dan, any sort of final thoughts that you might have about where this leaves us, where this will take us into the future that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just following political debates all over the world. I mean, again, I'm in Europe and Germany is about to have elections. I mean, immigration is really one of the top issues. I'm following what's happening in the US right now. I find it interesting that globally, like if I think back to the last 5, 10 years, we weren't really talking that much about immigration in our respective societies. And suddenly this is like, one of the top one or two topics that's being discussed, and
Mm,
everything in the news now seems to be related to immigration. So I'm really interested in beyond just winning the next election, how are governments thinking long term around policy related to creating sustainable immigration, where there's not going to be a huge backlash, immigration that's really going to benefit the economy, taking the emotions out of it. I'm really interested in how they're thinking about that. And yeah, I think that it's for another time, but my personal opinion is that the post-World War II liberal order that we lived in and that we grew up in has come to an end. We're in a very interesting transition period right now to a brand new era. We had like 70 years of relative stability, prosperity, and peace. We're now about to enter something else. Immigration is going to continue to be something that governments focus on, that voters focus on. And I think that it's very important to have people in law and policy that are thinking about this, people like yourselves, students at LSE like myself and my peers. And I'm hoping that we can make a positive contribution so that immigration isn't perceived as something scary and taboo.
Yeah. That's
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts. And Rabia, thank you for having me on again. I
you're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
This was good. Do you have any last comments, Daniel? Do you want to add anything else?
I hope that I am unfortunately pessimistic about the future of uh, Canada with respect to how it'll treat the international students who came and committed their time here. But there are still some legal options that are available.
Yeah.
And I want, if I guess, have a message for international students that are here. Um, you know, Despite everything that you're hearing that's happening around you, it's not your fault. You're not in control of the situation. And make sure that you have, I guess, the right resources, information, a good advocate that is going to be able to guide you through this next step of your journey, who's going to be honest with you about your prospects. And if there's a pathway there for you for permanent residency,
Yeah.
I know I am. I know you probably are too. Happy to help. And
Yeah.
keep listening to experts like Dan, who seem to be passionate and understanding of the issues. So thank you, Dan. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for
Thank you,
having me.
Dan. It was a pleasure, and this was really insightful. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.